At 11:38 in the morning, white vapor drifted across the launch pad, and the engines lifted Challenger into air so cold it had left ice on the hardware. 73 seconds later, that climb was over, and the country was staring at a shape in the sky it did not understand yet. This is the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a chain of physical facts and human decisions. 7 people were on board. One of them was Krista McAuliffe, the teacher whose flight pulled classrooms into the story in a way no earlier shuttle mission had done. For many viewers, this was not just another launch. It felt close, familiar, safe. The danger began before sunrise, in the cold itself, near -2 degrees Celsius, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and inside a part most people had never heard of, an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. Small, black, rubber, easy to miss in photographs. Easy, too, for an institution to treat as manageable after earlier warning signs had not yet ended in catastrophe. And then there was the night before. Roger Boisjoly, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, had urged a delay. He and others warned that the seals might not close properly in that temperature. Managers overruled them. A launch approval vote moved the mission forward anyway. If you want more long-form disaster reconstructions told with care, subscribe, because next we need to go into that cold night where this story was really decided. That night, the key room was not on the launch pad. It was a conference line. At Morton Thiokol, Roger Boisjoly and other engineers were trying to stop the launch before morning. Their concern was narrow, technical, and deadly serious. The O-ring seal inside the right solid rocket booster had shown troubling behavior before. And now, the forecast was colder than anything they were comfortable defending. Rubber is supposed to flex, press outward, and seal a gap in an instant. In deep cold, it stiffens. It answers pressure more slowly. And in this system, slow could be enough. What makes this part of the story so unsettling is how ordinary it sounds at first. Charts, prior data, questions about proof, procedure. The engineers argued that they did not have evidence the joint would hold in those conditions. That should have been enough. In safety decisions, uncertainty is supposed to make you stop. Instead, the logic began to turn. The pressure moved away from, can we show it is safe, and toward, can you prove it will fail? That shift matters. It changes the whole meaning of risk. A warning becomes an inconvenience. A technical limit becomes a debate point. And the launch approval vote starts to feel less like engineering and more like schedule management under a bright light. By the end of the night, the objection had been overruled. So when morning came and the cold metal at the pad carried a skin of ice, the most important danger was already locked in place, and the people looking upward were about to focus on the wrong thing. By the morning of January 28, 1986, the cold was no longer a forecast on paper. It was on the pad itself. Ice clung to metal surfaces. Frost sat where this program was used to heat, flame, and controlled motion. The air had that dry bite winter mornings get when you can almost feel it in your teeth. From a distance, the vehicle still looked magnificent. White orbiter, external tank, the paired boosters, but the weather had forced a visible problem into view. And visible problems are the ones institutions tend to respect first. So attention gathered around the ice. That mattered, because the most dangerous failure path in the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster was hidden deep inside the joint of the right booster. A seal, compressed inside hardware, waiting for ignition. The night before had already set the terms. Roger Boisjoly had warned about the cold. The concern had been dismissed. By sunrise, the system was moving forward inside two realities at once. One public, one technical. And meanwhile, ordinary life was making the launch feel even safer than it was. Krista McAuliffe's place on the crew had pulled schools into the event. Televisions were wheeled into classrooms. Teachers and students prepared to watch a lesson in national confidence. Families gathered as if this were a moment to remember for the right reasons. That contrast is hard to sit with now, because as the countdown resumed, most people were still looking at the frost on the outside, while the real threat was waiting for pressure from within. Once that hidden decision was made, the rest of the morning began to look almost normal. That is one of the hardest things about this case. Nothing in the public rhythm of the day announced what had happened behind the scenes. The launch remained a scheduled event. The crew moved toward a mission they had every reason to trust. Krista McAuliffe was still the face many viewers recognized. The school teacher, stepping into a machine built by experts, approved by institutions, presented as ready. And around that promise, ordinary scenes kept unfolding. In classrooms, television sets hummed and flickered. Coats were draped over chairbacks. Students leaned forward, waiting for the part that would feel historic in the best possible way. Near the launch site, families watched the pad through bright morning light, with cold air still hanging over the ground. The whole setting carried that strange mix of spectacle and routine, as if this were both rare and already familiar. Inside the program, that familiarity had weight. Flights had happened before. Warning signs had appeared before. The danger in the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster was not just a damaged part. It was the belief that a system could keep absorbing exceptions and still call itself safe. Years later, Diane Vaughan would give that pattern a name: normalization of deviance. But on this morning, nobody was using that phrase yet. They were counting down, looking at clocks, watching frost melt, waiting for clearance. The concern people could see was ice. The concern they could not see sat inside the joint of the right solid rocket booster, and the launch was moving into its final minutes. By late morning, the visible delays had done something deceptive. They made the process look careful. Ice had forced attention, waiting, rechecking. From the outside, that can resemble caution. If you're a viewer at home, or a parent near the viewing area, or a student watching a television cart rolled into a classroom, a delayed launch can feel reassuring. You think, they're being thorough, they're taking time, the machine is being respected. But the delay did nothing for the seal. Cold rubber does not recover because the clock moves forward. It changes when temperature changes, and the morning remained far colder than the system had been comfortable with. So the launch team was solving a surface problem while the deeper one stayed untouched in the right solid rocket booster. That is part of what makes the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster so difficult to study. The procedures were active. The checks were real. They just weren't aimed at the failure that mattered most. At 11:38, the countdown reached 0. Engines lit. The stack rose on a column of fire and white exhaust. To the crowd, it looked powerful, clean, exactly as a shuttle launch was supposed to look. In schools, children stood and watched. Krista McAuliffe was on her way, and for a few seconds, the public meaning of the day held together. But less than 1 second after liftoff, the first physical sign of the fatal problem appeared. No one watching live understood it. No one in those classrooms could have seen it. Even many of the people responsible for the launch did not see it in that moment. The cameras, however, did. At 0.678 seconds after liftoff, the first sign was already on film. A ribbon of dark smoke slipped out of the right solid rocket booster joint, thin enough to miss in real time, serious enough to matter forever. For a moment, the seal seemed to recover. Hot gas pushed products of combustion into the gap, and the leak appeared to close over. That is the part that makes this case so hard to read. The machine did not fail all at once. It hesitated, then kept going. In Utah, Roger Boisjoly watched the launch on television. On the pad, nobody in the control room had seen the smoke clearly enough to stop anything. The vehicle kept climbing, bright and steady against the morning sky, and for the public, it still looked like a normal ascent. But inside the booster, the cold had already done its work on the O-ring seal. Then came the next load, the next strain. At 37 seconds, the shuttle passed through severe aerodynamic stress. At 58.7 seconds, cameras picked up flame again at the side of the right booster. By 64 seconds, that flame had reached the external tank. Liquid hydrogen began to escape. And still, the calls on the net were routine. At 70 seconds, Mission Control said, "Challenger, go at throttle up." The reply came back calm, ordinary, professional. Then the flame widened, the structure gave way, and the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster moved from hidden failure into full view, while the last seconds were still unfolding. At 73 seconds, the structure could no longer hold. The flame from the right booster had reached the external tank, and once that happened, the stack stopped behaving like a single vehicle. The tank failed. Propellants were released. Aerodynamic forces took over immediately. On television, what people saw was a sudden white branching cloud high above the pad, a shape the eye could not process in the moment. That confusion is part of the record. In control, the first seconds after the breakup were marked by uncertainty. On the ground, spectators kept looking upward. In classrooms, children were still watching the screen, waiting for the normal next image. Krista McAuliffe had made the flight feel personal, and that made the silence afterward even harder to absorb. A live launch has noise, motion, commentary. Then, all at once, those familiar cues no longer matched what was in the sky. For a few beats, people did what human beings do when an event falls outside expectation. They searched for the routine explanation. Maybe it was staging, maybe separation, maybe the camera angle was strange. The mind reaches for the known before it accepts the irreversible. But this was the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, and by then, the outcome for the mission itself had already been decided. What remained unclear, and would remain painfully unclear for some time, was what had happened inside the crew cabin after the vehicle came apart, and whether the public had been told the full truth about those final moments. That question did not settle on January 28, 1986. It hung there. In the first public understanding of the accident, the breakup itself seemed to be the whole event. People saw the white cloud, heard the broken rhythm of the broadcast, and assumed the end had been immediate. That assumption was human. It was also, later, much harder to hold with confidence. Recovery work and investigation began under that shadow. The crew cabin had separated from the rest of the vehicle. That detail matters, not for spectacle, but because it changed the kind of questions investigators had to ask. What remained intact? What evidence survived? What could be said responsibly? And what had to wait? In a disaster like this, the first version the public hears is often the simplest one. The record tends to get more complicated as damaged hardware, telemetry, and recovered material begin to speak. For the families, of course, those distinctions were unbearable. For viewers in classrooms, the day had already split into a before and an after. Krista McAuliffe had been a bridge between the shuttle program and ordinary American life. Once the mission failed on live television, that bridge carried grief in both directions. And inside NASA, another kind of pressure was building. A machine had broken apart in front of the country. 7 people were gone. The visible cause was still unclear to most of the public. But beneath that uncertainty sat the buried engineering dispute from the night before. And once investigators reached it, the story would stop being only about hardware. That shift began when the investigation moved out of shock and into structure. The Rogers Commission was formed to find out what had failed, and, just as important, why the system had allowed that failure to reach the pad. This is the point where the story changes shape. A launch accident can be framed as bad luck. A commission asks whether it was also bad judgment, bad process, or a culture that had stopped reacting to warning signs the way it should. Roger Boisjoly's warning from the night before now mattered in a different way. Before the launch, it had been one more disputed technical objection. After the loss, it became evidence. So did the temperature. So did the record of concern around the booster joint. The same details that could be minimized before liftoff became impossible to ignore once 7 people were gone. That is often how institutional failure reveals itself, not by new facts appearing, but by old facts becoming undeniable. And then Richard Feynman entered the public story. Feynman was a physicist, not a program manager, and he had a gift the investigation badly needed. He could take a buried engineering problem and make it visible. Instead of leaving the issue trapped in memos and testimony, he reduced it to a physical demonstration anyone could understand. Cold changes material behavior. In this case, it changed it enough to matter. When he set up that demonstration, the country was about to see the central issue of the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster with its own eyes. And once that happened, the language of uncertainty became much harder to defend. Feynman did not stay inside the language of memos for long. He took the question out of the hearing room and put it on a table. A clear glass of ice water, a small O-ring, one simple motion. That was the point. Not to argue the entire history of the shuttle in abstract terms, but to show what cold does to the material itself. If the seal loses resilience when the temperature drops, then the concern from that night was never theoretical. It was physical. For the commission, and for anyone watching later, the demonstration cut through the fog. The part that should flex and spring back did not behave the way the system needed it to behave. That is all the evidence had been trying to say, just in a more expensive and more bureaucratic accent. The engineers had not invented a fear. They had described a limit. The machine was asked to fly outside it anyway. And that is where the deeper lesson began to surface. The launch did not happen because one person ignored one warning. It happened because the warning had already been made familiar. Normalization of deviance is a cold phrase, but it fits. The exception had been seen before and survived, so it stopped feeling like an exception. By the time the Rogers Commission forced the issue into the light, the country could see how dangerous that kind of comfort had become, and how much harder it is to admit a pattern once it has already cost 7 lives. And once that pattern had a name, the disaster became harder to keep at a safe distance. It was no longer only a story about January 28, 1986, or about one damaged joint in one booster. It became a case study in how institutions teach themselves to live with warning signs. Roger Boisjoly had tried to interrupt that process before launch. Richard Feynman had translated it for the public afterward. Between those two moments, the country was forced to look at the same event from 2 very different directions: the private warning and the public proof. That is why this investigation still matters. The hardware answer was clear enough. Cold changed the behavior of the seal. The joint leaked, the vehicle failed. But hardware alone does not schedule a launch. Hardware does not overrule concern. People do. Committees do. Cultures do. In the years after the loss, that realization stayed attached to the shuttle program like a shadow. And then, in 2003, it returned in a form that was painfully familiar. Columbia was lost during re-entry, under different physical circumstances, but the deeper pattern was recognized again. Different part, different moment, the same willingness to absorb danger because prior flights had survived it. That is what makes these investigations so unsettling. They are not only about what broke, but about what people learn, forget, and then repeat. Which brings us back to the human scale of it. Because after commissions, demonstrations, and analysis, one question still remains beneath all the system language. What exactly was left behind by the teacher whose lesson never reached orbit? For the teachers and students who watched that morning, the lesson was already over. What remained was the image of the empty sky and the blunt feeling that something had gone wrong in front of everyone. In Concord, New Hampshire, the classroom televisions had not been set up to teach grief. In Florida, the families near the launch site had not come expecting to study uncertainty. And yet that was the record now, and it could not be edited out. The public language changed slowly after that. First came hesitation, then the need for explanation, then the commission, then the names that would stay attached to the event. Roger Boisjoly, Richard Feynman, Diane Vaughn. Each one mattered because each pointed to a different layer of the same failure. Engineering, evidence, culture. That is why the recovery of the crew cabin mattered so much. It was not a headline detail. It was a physical witness. It meant investigators could test the public assumption against what survived. It meant the accident would not stay trapped in television footage and first impressions. The machine had failed, but the record was still speaking. And under that record sat the same hard fact that had been there from the beginning. The shuttle was not undone by mystery. It was undone by a chain of decisions made in cold weather, against warning, inside a system that had learned to live with small deviations. That is what made the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster so corrosive to trust and so impossible to forget. And that is where the story narrows again, from institutions back to a desk, a classroom, a person. Christa McAuliffe was more than a symbol attached to the mission. She was a teacher, and that mattered in a very practical way. Her presence changed who watched the launch, but it also changed what had been meant to come after it. The flight was supposed to carry education into orbit in a form children could actually feel, not as a distant technical achievement, but as something brought back to them by someone from their own world. That is part of why the loss hit so differently. When the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster entered public memory, it carried more than the image in the sky. It carried interruption. A lesson stopped before it began. A familiar voice removed from a place that had seemed safer than the launch pad, the classroom. Roger Boisjoly exposed the warning before liftoff. Richard Feynman exposed the material truth after it. But Christa McAuliffe exposed something else without trying to. How a national technical failure lands inside ordinary life. And ordinary life leaves artifacts. Smaller things. Not wreckage, not commission reports, not the public record of hearings. The kind that sit flat, quiet, almost weightless, until you know what they belonged to. Teaching materials prepared for a mission that never reached orbit. Pages made for students who were waiting in front of television sets. In the final part, that is where we have to end. Not in the hearing room, not at the pad, but with what was left unfinished. What was left unfinished was not only a mission, it was a set of pages. After the investigations, after Roger Boisjoly's warning was vindicated, after Richard Feynman's glass of ice water made the material failure visible, the human remainder of this story could still be held in the hand. Krista McAuliffe had prepared lessons for students who were waiting to see their teacher speak from orbit. Instead, those plans stayed on Earth, quiet and unread, in the way only interrupted work can be. That may be the clearest measure of the loss. A failed O-ring in the right solid rocket booster can be diagrammed. A launch approval vote can be reconstructed. The phrase Diane Vaughan gave the pattern can explain why the warning system went dull. But the full weight of the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster lives somewhere smaller too, in the distance between a prepared lesson and the moment it is never given. Paper is patient. It does not argue with managers. It does not appear on live television. It just waits, year after year, carrying the shape of a morning that was supposed to happen differently. And maybe that is why this story endures. Not only because a shuttle broke apart in front of the country, but because a classroom had already been built around what came next. Somewhere, a set of teaching notes still exists, and the silence around them says enough. The cameras are gone now. The hearing rooms are quiet. The pages remain. If you want more careful reconstructions like this, you can subscribe and stay with the channel. If this story stayed with you, a quiet comment is always welcome.